Imagine a world built on scale, forests so vast their crowns lost themselves in a permanent mist, ferns and cycads towering like living columns, and a light that never quite burned, soft, diffused, as if filtered through a vaulted glass. Beneath that gentle illumination, life moved slowly and grandly. The ordinary rhythms of human labor were measured against trunks the size of houses, against beasts whose footsteps trembled the ground. Yet within that beauty there lay a tension, a quiet, widening fissure between creation's order and a corruption that would not be contained. This is what life may have looked like roughly 5,000 years ago, before the Great Flood: abundant, magnificent, and, according to ancient traditions, dangerously compromised. The ancient texts paint this pre-flood world with both wonder and alarm. Genesis gives a brief but striking note of what followed the union of the sons of God and human women. There were giants on the earth in those days, Genesis 6:4 tells us, a short line that echoes through later stories and imaginations. The Book of Enoch, an extra-canonical text preserved in Jewish and Christian tradition and cited by many ancient interpreters, expands the scene, describing heavenly beings who descended, taught secret arts to humankind, and produced offspring that were unlike anything the world had known. When we bring these sources together with archaeological imagination and comparative myth, an image emerges, a planet of immense growth and productivity, reshaped overnight by forbidden knowledge and monstrous new life. Under the canopy, daily life was logistics at scale. Homes were often carved into or built among colossal trunks, hollowed spaces serving as communal rooms where families slept and stored harvests. Food procurement required tools and techniques adapted for giants, fruit that hung from branches beyond ordinary reach, tubers and bulbs that required teams to extract, freshwater lenses pooled like ponds where herds congregated. The air was humid and cloud-like. Without the harsh angle of direct sun, seasons were less a matter of light and more of water and heat, moderated perhaps by a canopy of vapor described in some traditions and by later interpreters as a protective layer that altered weather patterns. Travel was measured in the shadows of trees, and a child's height was a tiny fraction of what dominated the landscape. Fauna of this world matched the flora in scale. Ancient poetic images and later theological readings point to creatures of enormous bulk. Job's poetic portrayal of Behemoth, a primeval creature, which I made along with you, Job 40:15-24 in poetic context, has long been read as a literary echo of such megafauna, an animal of massive strength, a hip bone like a tower, eating grass like an ox.
Whether behemoth corresponds to any single prehistoric species is a matter of interpretation. The point in the ancient literature is theological and symbolic as much as it is descriptive. The created order included forces and creatures beyond common human dominion. In everyday terms, people would have lived with the constant awareness of enormous herbivores that could strip a grove in hours, and aerial predators whose wings cast sweeping shadows, able to carry off livestock and sometimes threaten humans themselves. Vigilance, community cooperation, and structural ingenuity were necessary for survival. Into that world of towering life and diffuse light, the ancient narratives tell of a different arrival. Beings who came down from the heavens and crossed the boundary between divine and human domains. The Book of Enoch, in its Watchers section, narrates how a group of angels, called the Watchers, saw the daughters of men and desired them. Among their leaders, the text names Shemshaza and Azazel and Barakel as prominent figures who not only mated with human women, but also revealed to humanity arts that had been withheld. The language is dramatic. Luminous visitors, commanding in bearing, multilingual in speech, teaching in ways that seemed miraculous. The Enochic account is extra-canonical. It is not part of the mainstream Jewish and Christian canons for all traditions, and its authority varies, but it preserves an older tradition about celestial visitors who became cultural agents of change. What the Watchers brought, according to these traditions, reads like a catalog of accelerated civilization. They taught metallurgy, how to smelt metals, to shape bronze and iron, to fashion blades and plows that changed the balance between human labor and force. They taught the uses of cosmetics and adornment, the secret recipes that altered appearance and social standing. They taught pharmakia, the use of herbs and compounds for potent effects, and by some accounts, the crafting of intoxicants and substances that clouded judgment. They taught astrology, reading the sky not merely for navigation, but for divination and control. They taught musical arts, new rhythms, new instruments, songs that could move crowds. The Book of Jubilees and other traditions echo these changes, attributing the rise of specialized skills and the sharpening of social stratification to those gifts. Tubal-Cain becomes an archetype in later memory, the metalworker who forged weapons, Jubal a progenitor of musicians, both names anchored by Genesis and later tradition as epitomes of technological and cultural innovation. But whenever forbidden knowledge enters a culture without an ethic to govern it, the consequences can be swift. The narratives insist the gifts were not neutral inputs into a stable society. They altered human desires and capacities in ways that fractured communal life.
Weapons became instruments of domination. Ornament and cosmetics became tools of deception and social dominance. Pharmakia fostered dependencies and rites that altered human perception and moral restraint. Some traditions, most explicitly the Book of Enoch, blame Azazel for teaching the cutting of roots and the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates, a phrase that links material craft to social violence. Ancient writers interpreted these technologies not merely as progress, but as accelerants, knowledge used without wisdom, power wielded without restraint. The most unsettling consequence in the narratives is the birth of the Nephilim, the giants. Genesis 6:4 connects the presence of sons of God and human women with the appearance of these extraordinary beings. The Book of Enoch elaborates, these offspring were born into the world already out of proportion. Some traditions describe them as huge at birth, growing at speeds unmatched by ordinary children, reaching adult size within years rather than decades. Their physiology, as the texts emphasize, was marked by prodigious strength and appetites that ordinary food could not satisfy. Where the Nephilim went, forests and fields felt smaller, trees were felled by their movements, palisades ripped from the ground, and structures intended to contain men proved inadequate. Behaviorally, the sources portray them as leaders in a downward spiral. They became overlords who demanded tribute and built palaces and statues to themselves. They established bureaucracies of coercion, subjects, forced labor, and taxation, mechanisms of oppression foreign to earlier, simpler clan structures. Rituals escalated into public spectacles of dominance. The archaeological imagination here converges with textual imagination. Images of massive sculptures, broad plazas inundated with offerings, and terraces built for feasting and power reflect a civilization oriented toward display and control. Lamech's poem in Genesis 4, while earlier in the Canaanite context, is often read by interpreters as an escalation of violent boasting, a cultural artifact that hints at a condition in which violence becomes a valorized identity. Worse, the moral texts recount forms of sacrilege that crossed the threshold from ritual to atrocity. Public sacrifices increasingly involved human lives. Some traditions soberly suggest that in the worst excesses, practices of cannibalism and ritual consumption of human flesh occurred in desperation or devotion. The Book of Joshua and other later writings mention practices that, while difficult to verify historically, function in the narrative as ultimate signs of ruin, a community that sacrifices its own integrity to sustain the appetites of the powerful. Ancient writers, writing with moral urgency, held these practices up as evidence that the corruption had reached every level of society. Parallel to social corruption, the narratives present a biological collapse.
Genesis states that the earth was filled with violence, and that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Genesis chapter 6, verses 11 through 12 provides the context. This phrase, interpreted by many ancient and modern readers, is not only moral, but apparently biological in scope. The Book of Enoch expands this reading. It contains graphic images of hybrid births, monstrous offspring, and the mixing of species in ways that defy prior boundaries. Some interpreters use the phrase mixing of kinds to describe what the texts claim, unions and offspring that crossed previously established lines within creation. These images resonate with later mythic traditions, the titans of Greece, the chimera of composite beasts, the monstrous races of folklore, suggesting that cultural memory preserves a trauma of hybrid beings whose existence unsettled the categories of life. It is important at this point to bracket claims carefully. The accounts in Genesis and the apocryphal literature are theological narratives and mythic memories shaped by religious aims.
They are not straightforward scientific descriptions, nor should Enoch, Jubilees, or Jasher be presented as canonical scripture across all traditions. Many scholars approach these materials as reflections of ancient anxieties about technology, power, and boundary transgression. Some modern supporters of the narratives propose analogies: ecological collapse, rapid speciation events in prehistory, or paleo-ecological catastrophes to understand how such stories could have arisen. Such comparisons are hypotheses and interpretive models, not empirical proofs that the events occurred exactly as described. At the human scale, these changes triggered deep social fractures. Traditions describe a split between urban, technologically driven civilizations, often associated with Cain's line, and a nomadic, tent-dwelling remnant associated with the line of Seth, those who sought to preserve older religious and ethical practices. The cities of Cain, as remembered in the texts, concentrated wealth and machinery of coercion. They produced the palaces, the forges, and the social apparatus that favored the Nephilim and their human allies. The tent societies, by contrast, maintained a form of religiosity tied to stewardship and memory. This cultural division deepened as the Nephilim's power grew, making the world increasingly inhospitable to the practices of the faithful remnant. Ecologically, the narratives say the land itself began to fail. Habitats that had once cooperated with human patterns broke down under the strain of overhunting, the trampling of gigantic herds, and the introduction of new disruptive technologies. The phrase "all flesh corrupted" frames this as an all-encompassing breakdown. Plants and animals that once reproduced according to their kinds began to show aberrations. Mortal wounds to ecosystem balance led to famine in some regions and unchecked excess in others.
Mythic parallels emerge, tales of monstrous hybrids, of animals composed of mismatched parts, as cultural memories attempting to record a time when life itself departed from its intended order. As these tensions climbed, the ancient sources converge on a single, decisive solution: a cosmic reset. In Genesis, the narrative voice reports a divine decision to judge the earth, culminating in the sending of a great flood. The mechanism, as Genesis and related traditions describe it, combines water from two realms, above and below. Genesis speaks of the windows of heaven opening and the fountains of the deep bursting forth, language that, interpreted within the tradition, suggests both precipitation from an upper reservoir and subterranean hydrostatic disruptions. The Book of Jubilees and other apocryphal sources expand this imagery, connecting the collapse of a protective vapor canopy with massive tectonic convulsions and the release of subterranean waters. Together, these texts describe a hydrological catastrophe of planetary scale. Cinematic reconstruction of such a catastrophe emphasizes suddenness and scale. Imagine the air growing heavy and cold as the canopy collapses, the sky darkening with the compression of vapor into rain. The first drops would strike like percussion on leaves the size of sails, then swell into sheets. Rivers would surge beyond their banks as subterranean springs, compressed by geological shifts, burst into new outlets. Tectonic movement would tilt shorelines and crack continental shelves. Mountain faces would shed entire forests into avalanches. Cities built for human-scale assaults, walls, gates, and palaces, would find their foundations compromised as the world itself rearranged. The flood narrative in Genesis frames this not simply as a natural disaster, but as a decisive divine intervention to remove the corruption that had overwhelmed the created order. Noah occupies the narrative as the counterpoint to that corruption, a figure who preserves a remnant. Genesis depicts him as a righteous man, blameless in his generation, tasked with constructing an ark according to divine specifications. The ark, in the tradition, is not merely a boat, but an engineered refuge, a sealed structure meant to preserve life against a universal deluge. For centuries, the ark was an object of ridicule among neighbors, a visible sign of faith misunderstood. Yet when waters rose and cities sank, it became the vessel of preservation for Noah, his family, and the animals entrusted to his care, a microcosm of the pre-flood order meant to seed its restoration. The scenes of the flood are narrated with sober gravity in Genesis. After the rains and the breaking of the deep, the world is inundated. All that had life on dry land perishes except those preserved in the ark.
The Book of Enoch and Jubilees emphasize the moral logic. The flood serves as a purification, a radical act of remediation to remove a pervasive corruption that human means could not correct.
The texts that expand the story view the flood as a cosmological reset intended to re-establish the boundaries of creation, to reassert the distinction between kinds, and to purge the social systems that had made murder, idolatry, and monstrous appetites normative. The aftermath is a landscape of silence and memory. Genesis describes the waters receding and Noah's family emerging to a cleansed but altered earth, one with the bones of defunct cities and the memory of giant tracks and ruined forges. Later cultures transformed those memories into myths, the titans of Greek lore, the giants of Near Eastern stories, and monstrous figures that populate folklore. Legends preserved fragments, colossal footprints, ruined terraces, tales of singing that once commanded armies, but they were refracted through new cultural lenses and new theological understandings. If we step back and ask why such narratives persisted, the answer lies partly in how communities encode trauma. Stories of world-shattering catastrophe answer a need to explain why the world is ordered as it is, why human life is finite, why beasts are fearful, why social power must be constrained. In the religious imagination, the flood functions both as judgment and pedagogy, a lesson about the dangers of misapplied knowledge, the hazards of moral abandonment, and the necessity of stewardship within limits. The apocryphal expansions, Enoch, Jubilees, Jasher, amplify the moral and cosmological stakes, offering details meant to teach and to warn, even as their historical status differs across traditions. Scholars and interpreters approach these texts through different lenses. Some read them as mythic memory of natural disasters that left an imprint on oral traditions. Others see them as theological reflections on ancient social anxieties about power, technology, and purity. Still others treat the apocryphal accounts as valuable cultural artifacts that reveal how communities negotiated the mystery of evil and its remedies. It is instructive that across cultures, stories of giants, fallen celestial beings, and catastrophic waters recur. Whether one reads these as literal reportage, theological allegory, or cultural memory, they function to wrestle with a question that is always present. How does a good creation become so grievously broken, and what, if anything, can reset it? In describing the pre-flood world, then, the narrative must fold paradox. Abundance and collapse coexisted. The canopy and the megaflora allowed an Edenic-like productivity, while the arrival of forbidden arts and the birth of giants introduced dynamics that unstitched communal life.
The Watchers' gifts accelerated civilization, but also weaponized it. The Nephilim's strength outpaced compassion. Social institutions warped into instruments of tribute and sacrifice. Ecological networks failed under new pressures. The flood emerges in these sources as the tragic but necessary correction. For viewers intrigued by the practicalities of survival in such a story, the Ark invites further inquiry. How does one design a vessel to preserve life through a global deluge? What kinds of materials and architectural principles would be necessary to house animals, store food, and provide ventilation and waste management at scale? These are the engineering questions that have animated generations of thinkers, and that invite a deeper technical examination, a companion subject that takes the narrative of Noah and considers its pragmatic implications. The memory of that pre-flood age endures in the languages of myth, in the bones of old ruins, and in the theological concern that knowledge without justice can become a catalyst for ruin. The stories of Azazel, Shemshaza, and Barakhel, the figures of Tubal-Cain, Jubal, Lamech, Enosh, and Enoch, the warning in Genesis about the perils of unchecked violence, all of them cohere into a portrait not simply of a distant past, but of an enduring moral warning. The flood narrative, then, is not merely a tale of cataclysm, but a theological thesis. When creation structures are distorted by hubris and corrupt practice, a corrective, however severe, may be enacted to restore the integrity of life. If this reconstruction has piqued your curiosity about the Ark itself, its construction, its internal design, and how such a craft could conceivably house a remnant of life through a planetary catastrophe, there is a companion deep dive that examines those questions in technical and historical detail. For now, the story stands as a solemn reminder: a world of extraordinary abundance can be fragile, and the misuse of knowledge, however advanced, can produce consequences that ripple through every level of creation. What we are left with is a sobering tableau, a planet once lush and strange, touched by heavenly visitors whose gifts reshaped destiny,
populated by beings of extraordinary size and appetite, and ultimately swept by waters meant to reclaim a creation that had fallen into an unnatural state. The flood, in the narrative arc of Genesis and its related traditions, is both an ending and a beginning, an erasure of corrupting elements and the seedbed for renewed stewardship. For those who study these texts, the conclusion is not simple triumphalism. It is a call to remember how fragile order is, and to consider with humility the ethical responsibilities that accompany knowledge and power.
If this account opened new pathways of thought for you, please like and subscribe for more deep explorations of ancient texts and their possible worlds. And click through to the Ark engineering breakdown to see how a single vessel became the planet's lifeline in the story of the flood.